The horrifying story of the woman who created a monster, her sexual practices that destroyed her two sons. That was what Arthur wrote in his final journal, found clutched in his dead hands in 1958, page after page of tormented confessions about his mother, Beatrice, and something he called the unveiling, twisted, nightly rituals in a room he named the cleansing chamber. His daughter thought he was insane until she arrived in the perfect little town of Havenwood, Massachusetts, where her grandmother was beloved as a saint, where her Uncle Thomas, a grown man of 38, still followed his mother's every command with the vacant eyes of a broken child. The town protected Beatrice. The church praised her devotion. But those scratches on the inside of Thomas's bedroom closet told a different story. So did the pharmacy records, showing decades of belladonna purchases, and the cult documents hidden in the library basement, something called the Elysian progeny that preached hereditary purification through unspeakable methods. What did Beatrice do to her sons in that room? How does an entire town choose silence over two destroyed lives? And why was Thomas still trapped 30 years later in his mother's perfect, horrifying prison? The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 1958, delivered by a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 and who avoided eyes as if bad news were contagious. She stood in the doorway of her Beacon Hill apartment, still wearing her nightgown, reading the words that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her father. Arthur Whitmore, age 53, found dead in a boarding house in Providence. No next of kin except one daughter in Boston. Please collect remains and personal effects at your earliest convenience. Ara set the telegram on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, waiting to feel something, other than the hollow ache that had lived in her chest for the past 10 years. Her father had been dead to her long before this telegram arrived, vanishing 3 days after her mother's funeral when she was 15, leaving only forwarding addresses that changed every few months and letters that grew, shorter and more incoherent. The last one had arrived 2 years ago, 4 lines in, handwriting she barely recognized. Ara, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was the only way to keep you safe. Don't look for me. She had built a life around his absence, carving out a space among the dusty stacks of the Boston Public Library, where silence was sacred and questions had answers if you knew where to look. At 25, she was the youngest head librarian in the institution's history, respected by colleagues who admired her precision and feared her sharp tongue. She had never married, telling herself independence was a choice, rather than the result of learning. Too young that people who were supposed to love you could disappear without warning. The coroner's office smelled of disinfectant and something sweet rotten that clung to the back of her throat. The clerk handed her Arthur's effects. No money, no will, just the clothes he wore, and a small leather journal worn smooth, its broken brass lock pried open by authorities. There was a note tucked in the binding, the clerk said, addressed to you. Ara unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was Arthur's. Steadier than in recent years, she said, "It was for our own good. Don't let her erase him." Back in her apartment, she sat with the journal, studying the broken lock, deciding if opening it was betrayal or love. She had nurtured resentment toward Arthur like a careful gardener. She wasn't sure she was ready to understand him. But the note haunted her. Who was she? Who was the him that needed protection? The first page stopped her heart. July 1936. Thomas turned 9 today. Mother says he's ready for the first ceremony. I tried to tell her he's still too small, but she says the purification can't wait. Our father's blood runs thick with sin. Only the unveiling can cleanse us. I have to protect him. Later entries painted a childhood in Havenwood where Beatrice conducted spiritual cleansings in the chamber, stripping the boys naked, examining them while whispering prayers about bloodline purity. The tea made their heads spin and limbs heavy. Thomas stopped fighting. Arthur felt himself breaking too. The worst part was how Beatrice smiled afterward, holding them, saying how proud she was, making it feel like love. By 1942, Arthur was 18, planning escape to Boston College. But guilt over leaving Thomas paralyzed him. Thomas was 16, yet still the 9-year-old who crawled into Arthur's bed shaking, asking why Mother hurt them if she loved them. Arthur left in 1943. The guilt followed. Nightmares, flinches at touch. Failed marriage. His wife's tenderness couldn't overcome terror of intimacy. After Ara's mother died, Arthur saw Beatrice in himself when he watched his sleeping daughter. The corruption runs too deep. I have to leave before I become the monster my mother created. Ara closed the journal as darkness fell. For 10 years she had called him weak. Now she understood his abandonment was the final, desperate act of a man protecting her from horrors he couldn't trust himself to contain. But Thomas was still in Havenwood, living a nightmare that had lasted 20 years. The note made sense. Don't let her erase him. Arthur was begging her to save the brother he hadn't been brave enough to rescue. The next morning, Ara called in sick for the first time in 3 years, packed a suitcase, and drove west toward a town she had never heard of, but that held every unanswered question about her family. Havenwood looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. White fences, maples blazing October fire, sidewalks without cracks, leaves arranged as if nature obeyed the town's need for perfection. The Whitmore house on Elm Street was a cream and sage, Victorian with wraparound porches embracing manicured gardens. Ara stood at the gate, Arthur's journal heavy in her purse, trying to reconcile domestic bliss with the house of horrors her father described. Beatrice answered the door herself, 71 yet moving with youthful grace, silver hair in an elegant chignon, blue eyes lighting with apparent joy. "My dear child, I knew you would come. Thomas and I have been waiting." The interior gleamed, antiques, fresh flowers, photographs of generational happiness. Thomas waited in the kitchen, tall and lean like Arthur had been, but with the unlined innocence of a child. His hands folded like a schoolboy awaiting permission. When introduced, he smiled and nodded but said nothing, eyes sliding away. "Thomas is shy with strangers," Beatrice cooed. "But so excited, aren't you, dear?" Thomas nodded obediently. Something cold settled in Ara's stomach. This was the vacant compliance Arthur had written about. Over dinner, Beatrice spoke lovingly of Arthur's childhood, cherished boys raised with strong morals. Arthur, she said tearfully, had been sensitive, prone to dark imaginings. Convinced evening prayers were sinister. She had consulted doctors and ministers. The diary was evidence of hysteria. "I only wanted to protect them from corruption," she sighed. Ara listened in horrified fascination, as Beatrice reframed every detail from the journal into proof of her martyrdom. After dinner, Ara explored alone. Thomas's childhood bedroom was preserved, child-sized furniture, Bible pictures, pressed flowers. In the closet, she found deep scratches and words carved by a child's hand. "Tommy was here. Tommy was here. Tommy was here." The desperate graffiti hit her like a blow. Beatrice appeared in the doorway, voice fond. "Thomas used to hide there, always scratching. I taught him destructive behavior had consequences. Eventually, he learned to control himself." The maternal tone made clear the decades of conditioning that had produced the obedient shell downstairs. "Arthur was troubled by fantasies," Ara tested. Beatrice smiled, something predatory flickering. "Thomas learned to trust me completely. He understands Mother always knows best." Arthur could have found peace if he hadn't been so stubborn, standing among the evidence of a stolen childhood. Ara understood the true scope. Beatrice had erased her son's capacity for independent thought, genuinely believing she had saved them. The Havenwood Public Library was a brick relic with tall windows and golden dust motes. The elderly librarian recognized Ara instantly. Whispering condolences and praise for Beatrice's saintly devotion, Ara asked about local religious movements of the 1920s-30s. The woman's face shadowed. She directed Ara to the basement archives. Hours among deteriorating boxes yielded nothing until closing time, when Ara found a 1928 pamphlet, The Elysian Progeny, dedicated to hereditary purification through intimate examination of young vessels. A photograph showed a radiant young Beatrice among the leadership, praised for innovative childhood purification. That evening, Ara visited Mr. Abernathy, the pharmacist. Recognizing Arthur's daughter, his face grew somber. "Your father tried to protect his brother." Shown the pamphlet, he paled and retrieved a cracked ledger. Since 1935, Beatrice had purchased massive quantities of belladonna, valerian and psychoactive herbs, dates matching. Arthur's worst journal entries about bitter tea that made everything fuzzy. "I asked once," Abernathy whispered. She smiled and said the boys were helping with healing experiments. But they changed, grew quiet, especially the younger one. Back in her hotel room, Ara laid out Arthur's journal, the pamphlet, the ledger. Beatrice had followed a systematic program of drugged compliance and ritual abuse, disguised as spiritual discipline. The next morning, Ara confronted Beatrice in the garden, Thomas weeding nearby with mechanical care. She spread the evidence on the table. Beatrice studied it calmly, then teared up. This breaks my heart to think Arthur's delusions have infected you, she reframed. Everything, the cult, a youthful search for answers, the drugs prescribed for the boy's nervous conditions, Arthur's accusations proof of deepening illness. In 20 minutes, she dismantled every fact, turning Ara's weapons against her until Ara herself felt disoriented, questioning reality exactly as Arthur once had. Beatrice embraced her with suffocating tenderness. This obsession isn't healthy, darling. Go home to Boston. Ara packed mechanically and fled to a motel 30 miles away, fleeing like her father 25 years earlier. In the shabby Riverside motor lodge, she reread the journal. No longer seeking evidence, but glimpses of the brother Arthur couldn't save. Early entries described a bright, curious Thomas who collected feathers, mimicked birds, carved a lopsided wooden freedom bird for Arthur, painted blue, promising it could fly anywhere without permission. Arthur had kept it as a talisman. Ara realized Thomas wasn't erased, only buried. Even in Havenwood she had seen flickers, gentle hands in the garden, a moment of alertness in his eyes. Arthur's guilt hadn't been only for abandoning Thomas. It was for recognizing rescue was possible, yet feeling too damaged to try. Ara was different. She had never been in the cleansing chamber, never had her reality dismantled. She could do what Arthur couldn't. She returned to Havenwood on a pewter-skied November Sunday while Beatrice attended church. She found Thomas kneeling in the garden, apron protecting Sunday clothes, a tiny act of independence. Instead of questions, Ara hummed the folk ballad their father once sang, the secret song of a caged bird who had forgotten its wings. Thomas froze. She sang softly, "The lock is rust, the cage is old. Freedom song still knows your name." His trowel fell. Tears streamed. "Arthur used to sing that," he rasped. Ara unwrapped the crude wooden bird she had found hidden in his childhood drawer and placed it in his trembling hands. Something fundamental shifted. The mask fell. "She said Arthur was sick," Thomas whispered, voice raw with 30 years of suppressed memory. "But it happened. The room, the tea, everything." Footsteps on gravel announced Beatrice's return from church. Thomas instinctively began retreating into compliance, but Ara touched his hand, gripping the bird. "You can choose differently." Beatrice appeared, immaculate. Voice gentle steel. "Thomas, dear, come inside so Mother can take care of you." For a moment he wavered, then his grip tightened on the wooden bird. "No," he said quietly. "I want to stay here with my niece." The single word cracked Beatrice's composure for an instant. Reverend Wilson, walking her home as always, paused at the gate, seeing Thomas weeping over a child's toy. Doubt crossed the clergyman's face. The perfect arrangement suddenly looked sinister. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was in a private psychiatric facility outside Boston, not because he was insane, but because he needed space to relearn being himself without constant supervision. The Reverend and Dr. Wilson, consciences finally pricked, arranged it quietly. Beatrice remained in her perfect house, reputation outwardly intact, but her absolute power broken. The town still saw her as the devoted mother of troubled sons. Yet the few who now knew carried permanent shadows of doubt. Ara returned to Boston with Arthur's journal locked in her desk drawer. Not a trophy, but private proof that love can survive systematic attempts to destroy it. Thomas was free. That was justice. Years later, when the leaves again blazed October fire along Beacon Hill, Ara sometimes took the journal from its drawer and read a single page by lamplight. She no longer felt anger, only the weight of a love that had crossed decades through ink and desperation. Thomas wrote to her now in a careful, childish hand that grew steadier with each letter. He had begun carving birds again, small, lopsided things painted blue like the sky he was slowly remembering. He sent one every birthday. They lined her windowsill, watching over the street with crude wooden eyes. The first time he visited Boston, he stood in her apartment clutching his coat, afraid to sit until she told him 3 times it was allowed. Then he saw the birds and wept without shame. The sound of a man discovering his own voice after 30 years of silence. They walked the public garden together. He stopped beneath the maples, face tilted to the sky, and imitated a red-winged blackbird so perfectly that strangers turned, astonished. "I used to speak to them," he said wonderingly. "I forgot I knew how." Beatrice died in the winter of 1964, still in her perfect house, still attended by townspeople who believed her a saint. The funeral was large, The church overflowed with lilies and whispered praise. Ara and Thomas did not attend. They stood instead on the frozen Charles River bank while Thomas scattered crumbs for the gulls, laughing when they wheeled overhead like white freedom songs made flesh. When news of her death reached them, Thomas was quiet a long time. Then he said very softly, "She really thought she was saving us." Ara took his hand. "She was wrong." He nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks. "But I'm here now." And that was the end of it. No trial, no headlines, no public reckoning. Just two people who had survived the same darkness walking into ordinary light. Some nights Ara still dreams of the cleansing chamber she never entered. A room that smells of lavender and lemon, polish hiding something sweet rotten underneath. She wakes gasping, reaches for the journal, and reads until the dream dissolves. She understands now why Arthur fled, not cowardice, but the purest form of love he could manage. He broke the cycle the only way he knew, by removing himself from it. Ara finished what he began. She thinks often of the wooden birds lining her sill, each one a small resurrection. Thomas lives in a quiet apartment near the harbor now, tends a community garden, teaches children to carve. They call him Mr. Tommy with affection. He smiles without asking permission first. When old Havenwood acquaintances visit Boston and recognize him, their faces crumple with confusion and guilt. He offers them coffee and speaks gently of forgiveness he has spent years learning to feel. Some leave crying, some never return. Ara never went back to Havenwood. The town remains perfect. Picket fences painted every spring, leaves raked into tidy piles, secrets buried beneath decades of polite silence. But perfection is brittle. Sometimes a child finds an old pamphlet in the library, basement, or notices scratches inside a closet, door that was never replaced. Sometimes a pharmacist's grandson discovers strange ledger entries and asks questions no one wants to answer. Cracks appear. Truth, Ara learned, is rarely a hammer. More often it is a seed, small, patient, impossible to kill once planted. She keeps the journal locked away because the story inside is no longer evidence. It is inheritance. And inheritance, like trauma, like love, passes forward whether we will it or not. The difference is what we choose to do with what we are given. On the 10th anniversary of Beatrice's death, Thomas and Ara drove to the coast at dawn. The sky was the exact blue he had once tried to capture with stolen watercolor paint. He carried a paper bag filled with wooden birds, dozens he had carved. Through sleepless nights when memory returned too sharply, one by one they launched them into the wind above the cliffs. The crude toys caught impossible updrafts, spiraling higher than skill should allow, until they became dark specks against the rising sun and finally vanished. Thomas watched until the last one disappeared. Then he turned to Ara with the clearest eyes she had ever seen on another human being. "Arthur kept his promise," he said. "He kept the freedom bird safe until someone could bring it back to me." Ara felt the old hollow ache in her chest fill it. Last, not with answers, but with presence. Two survivors standing where the land ends and the sky begins, watching small wooden souls rise on salt wind. They never spoke Beatrice's name again. There was no need. The cage had always been unlocked. They simply had to remember they were meant to fly. And they did, quietly, imperfectly. Without applause, two ordinary people, carrying extraordinary scars into ordinary light. Somewhere Arthur's journal rests in its drawer. Pages no longer trembling with accusation, but resting in the stillness of work finally completed. Outside Ara's window, the newest bird Thomas sent sits on the sill. Lopsided wings painted the color of morning. When the wind is right, it rocks gently, as if testing the air, preparing for a flight it was always meant to take. And that, in the end, is the only justice the dead ever asked of the living. Remember who we were before they tried to make us forget. 10 years after Beatrice's death, on a raw November morning in 1974, Ara received a letter postmarked Havenwood, Massachusetts. The envelope was thick, expensive cream stock, the handwriting precise and elderly. She knew it before she opened it, the seal of the Havenwood Historical Society. Inside was an invitation and a confession. The new librarian, a young woman named Ruth Caldwell, who had grown up hearing whispers but never the truth, had spent 2 years quietly cataloging the uncatalogued. In a locked tin box behind the furnace, she found more than pamphlets. She found photographs, medical diaries, a second ledger from a different pharmacy, and most damning, a reel-to-reel tape labeled in Beatrice's perfect copper plate. Purification session, Thomas, age 12, final unveiling, 1948. Ruth wrote that she had listened to it once, alone after midnight. She had vomited in the staff restroom and then sat on the cold tile floor until dawn, crying for a boy she had never met. She wrote that she could not live in a town that still polished the statue of a saint while that tape existed. She was going public. She wanted Ara and Thomas there when she did. Ara read the letter 3 times, then carried it down to the harbor apartment where Thomas now lived among his plants and half-finished birds. He read it without expression until the last page. Then his hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves. "I can't go back," he whispered. "I swore I never would." Ara touched the newest scar on his wrist, a thin white line from the night. He had tried to carve the cleansing chamber out of his own arm with a kitchen knife 2 years after leaving Havenwood. He had survived it. They both had. "You don't have to go back as the boy she kept in the cage," Ara said. "You can go back as the man who outlived her." Thomas looked out his window at the gulls wheeling over gray water. After a long time, he nodded once. 3 weeks later, they drove west in Ara's battered Volvo, the wooden Freedom Bird, now smooth and dark with handling, riding on the dashboard like a small brave pilot. Havenwood greeted them with the same immaculate silence, only now the maple trees were gone, cut down after Dutch elm disease, leaving the streets strangely naked and honest. Ruth Caldwell met them in the library basement at night. She was 28, pale, furious, and terrified. When she pressed play on the old reel-to-reel, Thomas made a sound Ara had never heard from a human throat. On the tape, a child begged, then bargained, then went quiet the way only the truly broken can go quiet. When it ended, Thomas stood up, steady as winter iron. "Play it again," he said. "Tomorrow, in the church. Let them all hear what their saint really sounded like." And for the first time in 36 years, Thomas Whitmore walked back into Havenwood not as a ghost, but as the living truth they could no longer bury. The church smelled exactly the same. Beeswax, lilies, and the faint metallic breath of old guilt. Sunday, 8th December 1974. Every pew was full. They had come for the annual Advent tea and the dedication of a new stained glass window donated in memory of Beatrice Whitmore, Ian Saint. Instead, they found the lights dimmed. Ruth Caldwell at the lectern, and Ara and Thomas standing on either side of an ancient, reel-to-reel projector like silent sentinels. Reverend Wilson, now 81 and trembling, tried to stop it. "This is a house of God," he quavered. Thomas stepped forward. His voice, unused to public space, cracked at first, then steadied. "This is the house where I learned. God was a woman who drugged me and touched me and told me it was love. Sit down, Reverend. You walked her home every Sunday. You will listen now." The reel began to turn. First the soft rustle of fabric, then Beatrice's calm, beautiful voice. "Open your eyes, Thomas. The angels are watching." A child's thin whimper, the clink of a porcelain cup. "Drink your tea, darling. It helps you see clearly." Then the sounds no child should ever make. Muffled, pleading, finally silent except for Beatrice's murmured prayers of purification. The congregation, aged 10 years and 12 minutes. Mrs. Abernathy, the pharmacist's widow, began to scream into her gloved hands. A deacon fainted clean away. Young mothers clutched their sons and ran into the cold. When the tape clicked to its end, the only sound was the furnace breathing in the basement, the same furnace that had hidden the evidence for 26 years. Thomas walked to the center aisle. He was 54 years old, hair gone silver, but his back was straight. "My mother is not in that window," he said quietly. "She is on that tape. You paid for the lilies. You praised her sacrifices. You looked away. Now look at me." He opened his coat. Beneath it he wore the same small boy's sweater. Beatrice had dressed him in for the final unveiling, preserved all these years like a relic of shame. It hung on his adult frame like a nightmare that had outgrown its skin. Someone in the back row began to sob, loud, ugly, unstoppable. It spread until the church sounded like a single wounded animal. Ruth Caldwell spoke last. "The Historical Society will release everything tomorrow. The tape, the photographs, the ledgers. The Commonwealth has been notified. There will be no more saints built on the bones of children." Thomas looked up at the stained glass Beatrice, radiant in blues and golds, and for the first time in his life he smiled without fear. "Take it down," he said, and before anyone could stop him, he picked up the brass candelabrum from the altar and shattered the window himself. Colored glass rained like broken halos. Outside, the naked elms rattled in the wind, finally free to tell the truth. The glass was still falling when the first police cruiser arrived, red lights painting the shattered saint across the snow. They arrested Thomas for vandalism in front of the entire congregation. He did not resist. When the young state trooper snapped the cuffs, Thomas looked at him calmly and said, "I've worn tighter chains." The words carried to the back pews. Someone vomited into a hymnal. Ara stood beside him in the aisle, clutching the wooden freedom bird so hard the old paint flaked beneath her fingers. Ruth Caldwell was already gathering the scattered tape boxes, tears cutting channels through her powder. The arrest made the evening news in Boston. By morning it was national. Man destroys church window honoring mother who abused him. Reporters camped on Thomas's harbor doorstep that never knew visitors. Old photographs of Beatrice, smiling, saintly, ran beside the police mugshot of her 54-year-old son. The Commonwealth reopened the case the same week. Exhumation orders were signed for Beatrice's grave. They wanted bone samples, hair, proof of decades of belladonna and scopolamine. Havenwood's perfect facade cracked like thin ice. Inside the Charles Street jail, Thomas refused a public defender. He sat on the edge of the cot carving a new bird with a plastic spoon he had sharpened against the wall. When Ara visited, he slid the half-finished creature through the slot. "For the window," he said, "when they let me out. I'm going to put something up there that tells the truth." The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution called it felony destruction of property. The defense, paid for by donations that poured in from strangers who had once been children in locked rooms, called it liberation. Thomas took the stand in the same child's sweater. He spoke without notes, without tears. He described the taste of the tea, the weight of his mother's hands, the exact moment at age 12 when he realized no one was coming to save him. When the prosecutor objected that the defendant was dramatizing childhood fantasies, Thomas looked at the jury and said, "Play the tape again." "I can wait." They played it. The jury asked for the lights to be turned off. They listened in total darkness. 12 strangers and the sound of a boy being unmade. "Verdict, not guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Thomas never raised his voice. He only asked the judge if he could keep the plastic spoon. 2 months later, on a morning so cold the harbor steamed, Thomas returned to Havenwood with a ladder and a single cedar panel he had carved through every night of his detention. In it was a boy reaching for the sky, wings only half grown, face turned toward light. Beneath, in letters deep enough to last centuries, he remembered he could fly. He hung it where Beatrice's haloed image had been. No one stopped him. The church was empty now. The congregation had scattered like birds from a gunshot. When the last nail was driven, Thomas stepped down, looked at the naked elms, and finally wept. Spring 1975 came late to Havenwood. The elms were gone, but new maples, small, stubborn things, had been planted along Elm Street by people who no longer spoke Beatrice's name. The Whitmore house stood empty, windows boarded, for sale sign rusting in the weeds. Children crossed to the other side when they passed it. Thomas and Ara returned only once more. They came on a Saturday in May, driving the same battered Volvo, the cedar panel wrapped in blankets on the back seat like a sleeping child. The church door hung open. Pigeons nested in the rafters. Sunlight fell through the broken rose window and painted the floor in blood-colored shards. Thomas walked the aisle alone. His footsteps echoed. He carried the panel to the front and set it gently against the altar rail, exactly where Beatrice's stained glass face had once looked down in eternal forgiveness. Ara waited outside beneath the half-grown maples. She watched him through the open doors, a tall man in a work shirt, silver hair tied back, moving with the careful grace of someone who had spent decades afraid of taking up space. When he knelt to unwrap the cedar, his shoulders shook once, hard, then stilled. Inside he worked for 3 hours. No hammer, only hand tools. The scent of fresh cedar and linseed oil filled the empty sanctuary. When he was finished, he had replaced the brass plaque that once read, "In memory of Beatrice Whitmore, beloved mother with a smaller one of his own making." For every child who was told, the cage was love, and the key was sin, we remember. Thomas Whitmore, 1975. He left the broken-colored glass on the floor. "Let it stay," he told Ara later. Let them sweep around the truth for once. They did not stay for the dedication no one planned. They drove east before dusk, windows down, radio playing something loud and alive. At the town line, Thomas asked Ara to stop the car. He stepped out, faced Havenwood one last time, and opened his hand. From his palm, a small blue wooden bird, the first one he had ever carved for Arthur, rose on the warm-up draft, circled once above the naked rooftops, then caught the wind and vanished toward the sea. Neither spoke until Boston's lights appeared. "I thought letting go would hurt more," Thomas said quietly. "It hurts exactly enough," Ara answered. They never returned. The church became a community center years later. The cedar panel and the shards of colored glass remain untouched. Children play beneath them now, chasing pigeons through sunbeams, unaware that the man who carved the boy reaching for the sky once sat in their same circle of light and learned, slowly, painstakingly, how to open his own hands. Somewhere out over the Atlantic, that small blue bird is still flying.